Welcome everyone to this chat about graceful degradation and service level objectives, hosted by Nobl9 and Stanza. First, wanted to make sure we did a little bit of introductions before we kick things off. First off, I will be your moderator and host. My name is Alex Hidalgo. I'm the principal reliability advocate at Nobl9 and author of Implementing Service Level Objectives. I've been an SRE for too long now and have quite a few feelings on both of these topics, and I'm really looking forward to guiding these experts through our discussion today. Now I'd like to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves, and I'd like to kick it off with Niall.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? All good? Excellent.
Good.
So I am CEO, founder of a teeny tiny startup in the traffic management and SRE adjacent space called Stanza Systems. I was previously in Amazon, Google, and Microsoft in various arms of cloud entities and ads entities and so on. If you know my name, it's probably because of the SRE book or workbook, which I was an instigator of and author and so on and so forth. But I've also written on AI, networking and history and a bunch of other things.
Excellent. Next up, we have Mandy.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mandy Walls. I'm currently a DevOps advocate for Pagerduty. Prior to Pagerduty, I worked at Chef Software for a very long time. And before that, I worked in web operations. Mostly, I spent a long time at AOL running things like AOL.com back when that actually mattered. So been around a long time and happy to be here today.
Fun fact, Mandy and I used to work together at AdMeld a million years ago.
Yeah, for a hot minute there. Yeah.
And finally, Macy.
Hi all, my name's Jennifer Mace, but I go by Macy, and I am a staff software engineer at Google after 11 years as an SRE at Google, which started on a team twinned with Niall's team, in fact, back in 2012. So I guess we're paired up on who's worked together today. But some of my work that's out on the internet includes some contributions to the SRE workbook and articles with O'Reilly on things like generic mitigations and multi-single tenant architectures and why you should not do them if you can possibly avoid it. So I'm looking forward to today's chat.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. And just want to make a note to all of our participants. We're going to be splitting this across a kind of fireside chats. Going to be prompting some questions and just finding out what our incredibly talented and genius level panelists have to say about these topics. But also, we want to hear from you. So feel free to start pointing, any kind of questions or points you have into the chat. We'll take some time at the end to kind of run through those questions. So just as things are going, feel free to post those in the chat. We'll get to them at the end. But really, I just want to start things off with, Niall, you were kind of the instigator of the concept of this webinar. And I really love the topic. I really kind of see how graceful degradation and service level objectives are very complementary concepts. But just to start off with, can you give us a starting definition of what graceful degradation actually means?
Sure thing. So graceful degradation is a rejection of the false binary that you can either have a success or a failure in your serving stack. It's basically saying, what if lol and sob, or what if 1 and 0 together? You are, it's clearest if I use an example. You're an image server maybe, and normally you would read something from disk and squirt it out the network, but sometimes the file on disk isn't there, or it's in the middle of being updated or whatever, so you serve from cache instead. Now, we're accustomed to thinking of cache replacement systems or caching systems as serving the original object that was intended in all of its glory, which isn't really a graceful degradation. A graceful degradation is typically serving something which is not quite what the user wanted, but good enough. So a perhaps better analogy would be, it's not an image server, but it's a video server, and we're not serving you the original 4K stream, but we're serving you 720p or something like that. And so not quite what you wanted, but maybe good enough. So somewhere on the 0.5 end of 0 to 1.
Makes sense. And that's a great way for a system to ensure it's able to tolerate some faults. And Macy, I know you have some opinions on fault tolerance and graceful degradation. Could you kind of explain what the difference might be?
Yeah, so fault tolerance is a property and graceful degradation is an action, right? So graceful degradation can contribute towards a system's fault tolerance, but there are other mechanisms of fault tolerance, for example, absorption of fault that will render a full 100% completely good result, even with back-end faults. Like Niall was saying earlier, if you have a perfect cache. So to get classical for a second, the Romans had a mechanism of building earthquake-proof buildings by putting their blocks diagonally. And then if there was an earthquake, the building tolerated the fault. But it's not gracefully degrading. It didn't degrade at all. It's fine, right? So fault tolerance is something that you want to engineer towards, and graceful degradation is a potential mechanism, depending on what your service is serving, to achieve tolerance in the face of fault.
Makes perfect sense. And just before we get into some more pointed questions, because this talk is about both graceful degradation and service level objectives, Mandy, could you give us a quick overview of what service level objectives are, just for anyone out there that may not be familiar?
Yeah, I mean, if you should be the one probably to tell everybody you wrote the book on these, right? So SLO, service level objectives, are your it's math. It's your goals for indicators that are important to hopefully your customers, and not just, you know, imaginary things that you've picked out of the stack, to verify that your systems are serving the experience that you want to, when they have a bit of a, gives you a bit of grace to be able to say our objectives are here and we can work towards those. And they are completely different from SLAs. SLAs are an internal tool. You work with your team. Your SLAs are probably contractually obligated. You might owe people money if you don't meet them. So they are tools for your internal team to work towards the goals that you have for the availability and process of your systems that you're working with. There is
Yeah, I
math.
mean, you want to make sure you're performant, but not spending too much time and energy trying to be too performant, you know?
Yeah. If you don't
As
need five
now,
nines, don't go for 5 nines.
yeah, as Now was mentioning, you know, if you're a streaming service and you have to degrade to 720p, well, that's probably okay as long as you're not always running at 720p, or not running at 720p so often for the people who are paying extra for 4K, for example.
But I like to boil it down to appropriate reliability is the goal of site reliability.
Yes, meaningful reliability, right? Like, are you aiming for the right thing? Is it appropriate? Do your users care? Are they happy enough? Are you overstressing your teams or not?
Yeah, if you're wasting time on things that you don't actually need to be optimizing for, you're just wasting time. You have other things to be doing.
So I actually like how this slides right into, you know, like if SLOs or you know, the quote unquote best SLOs are, you know, user facing or customer facing, consumer facing. In some way they're tracking a user journey. How do system, you know, degradation techniques, how can they help you achieve those goals?
Well, there's sort of two kinds of SLO that you might want to have in a system that you've decided that a degradation is useful for, which, to be clear, not all systems are worthy of engineering a graceful degradation, because engineering a good graceful degradation on purpose is tricky. And if you try to do it live, you will probably blow your system up. So maybe consider it in advance if you need it. But I've not found it to be effective to have a single layer of SLO while doing graceful degradation on purpose versus in an emergency situation, because you want a level of SLO that is measuring your optimal, like intended 4K screen to make sure that you're actually achieving that ever. And then if you're in a system that's deliberately under provisioned, or that this is a feature that's not a priority feature that you expect to degrade sometimes, you may also want to have a measurement at that level of, this is an acceptable degradation. Like, I'm in degraded mode, yes, but I'm still serving this one. Because again, these are team internal metrics. You can decide what it is you're trying to achieve with those metrics for your team rather than outward. So you can tell how often your degradation is having to be activated and use that to weigh your decisions for things like provisioning and engineering.
And
Niall
Niall,
had
I'm
a
curious, like, what do you think about, you know, if you're running in a degraded state, right? Like your system is able to identify that something's wrong and it changes its behavior slightly, right? perhaps your image server example, right? The file is not currently accessible for whatever reason, so you're serving from cache instead. Is that the kind of thing that should or maybe could impact your SLO measurement?
So there's a ton of nuance here. Like we could spend a long while talking about this. And in some sense, the complexity of appropriately representing the behavior, I'll use that word, or maybe the user experience, the complexity of figuring out how that relates to graceful degradation and SLOs is kind of equivalent to the complexity of deciding what your system should be doing in the first place. Like there's a ton of nuance depending on the particular thing you're trying to do. I think a lot of this is made clearer with examples, actually. So coming back to the image server thing you talked about, I think you could argue that serving out of cache, even if the file isn't available on disk or whatever, is an effective kind of one-to-one substitution for the user experience the user expects. Like the user is getting the image they wanted. It happens to be served out of a slightly different area of malloc RAM or whatever than it would otherwise have been. So user experience is essentially indistinguishable. What is distinguishable is internally we're all running around going, where did the disk go? Like if somebody needs to update this image, we are in trouble, or words to that effect. So if SLOs are going to be used primarily to represent externally facing user experience, and our graceful degradation is such that the user cannot tell the difference, then there isn't a strong argument for maintaining a kind of separate SLO structure. However, I'm going to say that outside of the case of caching, that actually there usually is a difference in the graceful degradation, and usually you are doing something which is, okay, like in the case of AI models, you might strongly prefer an answer from GPT-5, but somehow GPT-5 is busy right now calculating the end of the world or something, and Claude is available. So Claude will give you an answer which has different price performance characteristics. And let's say for the purposes of this conversation, you can draw a line between the quality of that and the user can tell a difference. Well, in any case, where the user can tell a difference and the user experience is, consequently affected, well, then it's SLO breaking in some sense, right? Or at least the user isn't getting what they expected. So in these cases, one way to proceed is you have separate SLOs for your graceful degradation operation and your standard operation mode, and you track them and assess them separately. Of course, like there is a fair bit of nuance here. We could imagine, for example, a situation where the graceful degradation offers a reasonable substitute for the thing, but at a much slower rate or latency. So if you had, for example, an SLO for service successful responses, that would stay the same when you are enacting the graceful degradation or the quotes limp mode, as I've heard it referred to. But you would fail the latency SLO because the latency is not what you said or what the user expects or whatever. So there's a fair bit of nuance.
Yeah, I think too, like it depends on what your goal is for the actual thing that you're serving. So another example I was thinking about was like my bank, right? They just redid the interface and it's like all this fancy garbage is on there now, and like all my accounts load, and then there's like recent activity, and then there's this little module on the side that reports my credit score. I don't care, but it's there every time. But it's obviously calling that from a different place, right? And if that thing doesn't show up, it doesn't impact the things that I'm usually looking for, which are like my account balances or to pay my bills or those kinds of things. But if it isn't there, it just collapses and it's silently not there. So my main experience is still great. It's what I wanted, but this little thing that was having some availability issue is now disappeared, and it doesn't impact my experience mainly at all. Someone who comes in and is looking for that thing might wonder what happened to it, but then there should be underneath for the teams that are running that thing at my bank, some other SLO around the main performance of the whole screen as a whole, the entire palette. and then the modules that every individual team is probably responsible for. Because on the back end, it's probably some maze of spaghetti coded microservices that are all doing their own thing. But being able to collapse those little features if they're not available preserves my experience to the main point, but allows whatever's going on in the back end to also be happening and be fixed sort of asynchronously to that.
And the thing that I love about your example is that this really highlights the value of understanding those which pieces of your glued together microservices are super important and should contribute to main SLO, because it lets you contribute your engineering resources to the things that matter, and lets you say, oh, that's a degradation target. Like, we can just let that die. If we're running short on CPU, we'll stop over provisioning that completely. Off it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you're in something that has a bit of like a content management system available to it, being able to pull things off the page when they're not performing well, if they're an experiment, if they're A/B testing, you can kind of get there sometimes with feature flags, depending on how you're using them. But when I've worked with publishing systems in the past, everything had a red button on it. If it wasn't loading, it was dependent on some backend system that wasn't responding or wasn't performant. You just take it off the page because it's going to degrade all the system if that one piece is everybody's sitting and spinning for it.
So, like, these are great examples. Like, I love that credit score box example, right? That's probably something that if it were to disappear, most users wouldn't even realize it's gone, right? Because they're probably not even expecting it to be there. But does that mean that the right kind of graceful degradation techniques, are they really about hiding failure from the user? Or is it more complicated than that?
So it's way more complicated than that. I mean, of course, I was going to say that. I'm wearing an orange jumper. Of course, it's more complex. I think the main thing about, let's take the example of recommender systems. So you have a recommender system. I'll stay away from the credit score thing because I think there is a, I will come back to it later because I think there is a specific thing to say about that. But the more general point I think could be made with the recommender system example. So you're on your Amazon or your e-commerce shop or whatever, and instead of the recommended for you page, you get the top 10 items that everyone on the site has bought or whatever. I don't know, Harry Potter or little lapel pins or whatever. Anyway, it turns out that in fact, most people tend not to buy one of the top 10 most popular items when you look at the distribution of how things are purchased on e-commerce. So long story short, the fallback or the failover or the graceful degradation that you have when you flip from personalized recommendations to some kind of default thing, it meets the user's expectation of having something else to click on if they're bored. It does not meet the user's expectation of having a set of things which are likely not to bore them when they click on them. So you have to be kind of case by case focused on whether or not this is meeting the user experience goals. But entirely separately, the absence of a recommender system usually has a significant effect on actual revenue and throughput, order throughput, and so on and so forth of an e-commerce shop generally. So a graceful degradation for a recommender system is often important enough to track separately outside of the pure context of whether or not this box was rendered on the website as you are viewing it. That is also potentially an introduction to graceful degradation on graceful degradation modes. Like, you could have a recommender system which is statically hard coded on the things you bought the last month, which is probably better than what everyone bought, or the mathematical average of what everyone bought in the past year or something, but is not as good as what you would have been shown if it had trained over the past month of your purchases. And so there are different models that you can build based on different data, and you could actually get very fine-grained about it. But I think coming back to the credit score example, the credit score example to me is kind of a disjunction because, as you say, Mandy, the people who are looking to pay for things and to see how much money they have and so on give zero hoots about whether or not that box is rendered. the people who are like, oh no, somebody has just defrauded me or whatever. I mean, I don't know why people will go to their credit score. They're getting a mortgage or something. What is my credit score? They think to themselves and load up the interface only to be disappointed. When there is a specific reason to do a thing for a small percentage of the user population and it's not available, then you have a tricky kind of SLO situation to represent, because the failure of it for much of the population doesn't damage your overall user experience assessment, shall we say, but it does highly specifically damage the people who have that job to be done in their minds. And so that is usually accommodated via a separate SLO for per service things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would hope, you know, with in a spherical service in a vacuum, that the product owner knows at some point how many people come in and click on that particular thing, right? Like with your recommendation systems, they know the engagement level of that recommendation system and can then appropriately say, we know that 46% of people engage with this. We know that 1.5% of people engage with this, whatever it is, and you make their adjustments appropriately based on how important that is to the regular workflow for the folks that are coming through that thing.
But I think, and Alex, remind me the exact framing of this question. This was around.
My original question here was whether or not graceful degradation is about hiding failure from users. And that's kind of what I started riffing off of.
Yes, so sort of. It's about, so taking aside for a second, so we've talked a lot about the product perspective on this so far. So take that aside for a second and come sit at the very bottom of the stack with me. So what graceful degradation is actually about, yes, is to a degree hiding failure, is having your service continue to serve its function. And so the product perspective is very important from understanding which bits of that function follow the 80-20 rule. If you can do 20% of the effort and get 80% of the value, what 20% of the effort should you be doing? But this is where it comes back to, if you're thinking about needing a graceful degradation, what are you mitigating? Is your service one that has latency problems because it's running from disk, then go to a cache? Is your service one that's running really tight on CPU? Is it really tight on a database? Is it reliant on a pipeline that's buggy? What is the thing you are degrading against? And then work backwards from there, from your real outages, not just the outages you think you might have, but look at your real outages and say, what resource do I want to lighten the load on to save my system? So Mandy's example of the microservice with a central hub that's rendering the system is a great one, because you have, if you are the spider at the middle of a web of microservices, you have to expect that any one of your threads might suddenly disappear on you. And maybe what you want to do there is render a static HTML link to a separate page that is just about credit score, that a user can hit refresh until the fucking thing renders, pardon my language. But the classic example, the original example I think we used in the SRE book on graceful degradation is web search. And if you are running short on, or your connection to the database is failing, or you're running short on CPU, can you serve 100 results instead of 10,000? Do the 10,000 even exist? Are you even serving them until somebody clicks through to them? Did you bother to do the work? So that would be my answer, is first find out the thing that you're resource constrained on, and then try to imagine how can you fill the user's need while using as little of that thing as possible. So make your degradations targeted based on the performance, not just the product.
I can totally follow that. Makes a lot of sense. I do want to circle back to something that Niall, I think, touched on, which is he was using the retail website recommendation box, right? And he offered a few different kind of potential scenarios, right? Either it's functioning correctly in the sense that it is trained on years of your purchase history, and these are likely very relevant, or as close as the computers can get, results to help you figure out what else you might be interested in. And a potential fallback for that might be just displaying the top 10 things that everyone's purchasing. And then a fallback to that might be just not displaying that box at all, right? If that service, whatever system that's responsible for generating those results, whether or not it is the trained model or the top 10, if that's entirely gone, maybe you just don't show anything at all. How often does it make sense or when should you be thinking about building potential multiple layers of fault tolerance?
Really good question. So coming from Macy's point, which I think is extremely beautiful, beautifully expressed, graceful degradation can stand in place of between the user and failure, or it can stand in place between the infrastructure and the user. And so you can reason back from, well, if we lose this backend system, then it would be great to just return true or whatever in this code. Or from the point of view of the user, it would be great if we were able to present them with all of the things they would like to click on, but maybe if we present them with something slightly different. So the overall motivation for graceful degradation can obviously come from these two paths that Macy is talking about, the product and infrastructure. And so we might say we have, I don't think it's quite this way, but we could think about it as revenue-oriented approaches and reliability-oriented approaches as if they were in tension all of the time. They are not in tension all of the time. But if we frame it this way for the moment, then we can go, okay, graceful degradation and consequent SLOs related to are things you would put in place if, when you completely lose that thing, there is a very significant revenue impact. Or if we lost the thing that replaced the thing, there would be a significant revenue impact. And so you can have some kind of sliding scale of responses. Meanwhile, from the reliability or infrastructure point of view, you could say this piece of distributed system over here is pretty flaky and we know it's bad. We should put something in place. Maybe, like, this is just an intuition thinking off the top of my head, but maybe the product-oriented view inclines you towards stacking to defend revenue, and reliability thinking inclines you to horizontal replacement in order to preserve experience. I see Macy raising her hand there.
I think that, well, to be starting with, like, let's differentiate between fault tolerance and graceful degradation. Because fault tolerance, yes, absolutely, must be baked in at every level of your system because failure is possible anywhere. But a lot of the time, this looks like things that we just do as part of our standard actions as professional software engineers, right? So this is looking like error handling. And this is looking like exponential back off for retries for RPCs. So that's one thing. Graceful degradation, no, you should not use graceful degradation for every situation. It's not a good tool unless you have a specific need. And I think that Niall's revenue, I would reframe to value, because not everything is revenue based. But yes, asking yourselves, when is the 1 versus 0 binary a damaging thing for your product? So imagine if a video website, and when it was overloaded, gave you nothing, versus giving you a pixelated 120p whatever, right? It would be, nobody is happy to get a 120 or a 360 when they wanted like a 4K movie to watch with their family, but they can still see it, and they're not going to go on the internet and say Netflix is down in the same way that they would if you got that nothing's there.
On the same token, though, I'm curious, are there situations where it might actually be better to be hard down so that the
Yes.
user understands, oh, this is not available right now, versus what is going on, right? Why is this video so bad, right? Like, are there good examples of where maybe just displaying a error screen is actually better than running degraded?
Not quite a visual one, but I've had outages in my past where we've turned off a big chunk of a stack because it would be revenue negative to have it running in its degraded state, because that was an unplanned degraded mode, right? So we turned it off, and people who were using that aspect of the product noticed and were like, what's happened? And we put it back eventually, but it would have lost money. So it got turned off.
Yeah, I can say, like, back in the bad old days, right, when we all had to host our own stuff, there was a series of settings on Netscaler, right? So Netscaler, hardware-based virtual IP sharing load balancers, monsters of internet gear. And you could, if you needed to or wanted to, have a failover scenario in the Netscaler where you would push a static page to represent your dynamic page so that it would serve when the whole back end fell over. So if you had a bad push or something happened, rather than having a stampeding horde that would just swamp all of your global DNS, you could just serve up this static page that represented an hourly push or whatever it was, a snapshot of the published thing that you were replacing, to pull back off of whatever was falling apart in the back end. I don't even know if they do that stuff anymore, to be honest. Like it's something that you could probably buy a different kind of service for now, but it was something that we had done in the past to still show usually technically savvy users like the main page of, say, whatever it was, this is AOL.com, and all the links that were active went somewhere else. They didn't come back to the systems, the farm servers that were falling apart. So you could then diverge that traffic into other places while you repaired what was going on in the back end. Kind of a nuclear option, right? To be able to fail over to straight static when your dynamic site was deeply, deeply catastrophically injured. So.
Well, another example has occurred to me, which is that think of scenarios when serving worse than what you should serve would be either dangerous or unhelpful to the user. So the mild example here is up-to-date hotel listings. Very frustrating, for example, for a user to fetch and decide to try to buy a hotel listing from your website, and suddenly it's sold out. Because
Concert
it's from
tickets,
6 hours
yes,
ago.
yeah.
Yeah, concert tickets. Like there's a bunch of things where it's like, okay, well, inaccurate would actually be worse here. Inaccurate is actively unhelpful, so don't annoy your users by rendering it.
And so, yeah, I think we could come up with a bunch of examples here, right? Like to extend that hotel example, we could even make it a little dangerous, right? You really, really need you're on a long road trip and you need to find a place to sleep, right? And you need to find a hotel, and your degraded system allows someone to book a hotel room that doesn't actually exist, right? And now suddenly that person has to get back on the road even longer, right? We can come up with a million, like examples like this. But here, to bring it back to our SLO tie-in a bit, right? If you build a system that has these kind of states that it can fall into, would you have a separate SLO to track that? Like for Mandy's example, right? If you have a website of some sort that is capable of falling into a state where it's serving you a static page as kind of a fallback option to the more dynamic version that you would prefer to be serving, would you set a separate SLO on each of those, and perhaps an SLO that you only bring into play when you're in the degraded state?
If you're using SLOs to manage the performance of the system and the team together, right, as we were talking about earlier, like I think I would, right, like have expectations of, because it's internal, right? This is my internal metric that I'm working on with my team to manage our performance and the systems that we're working on. I think I would have and I was doing this way before SLOs were thought of, so like wasn't anything we were doing. So I would have the SLO for the top line customer experience. Yes, we're not down, we're giving them something, it's at least partially legitimate, it's fine. And then the actual service itself that's having a problem, yeah, that needs to be investigated, talked about, measured, and compiled wherever, however we're managing towards our SLOs as far as the team goes.
I think I disagree a little bit, or rather maybe I'd approach it a little bit differently. The standard question that I'm asking when I'm looking at a system and asking what should our SLOs be is, what is well functioning? What does well functioning mean for this system? And I think that we need to get comfortable with sometimes we're running with our SLOs failing. And that's okay. That's what they're there for. They're there to measure it, not to punish it. Right. So if my banking user can only see a static website, that is non-functional to them. Now it's functioning in that I guess I don't even know what would happen to them if it just completely vanished. They'd end up with a browser error or something. But like meaningfully for what that service is trying to accomplish, it's non-functional, right? Whereas if there's partial functioning, I might have a separate SLO for partial functioning.
I think hearing what both of you are saying, I did talk a little bit about maintaining SLOs for operation of the graceful degradation system itself, because, and the argument being that certainly internally you would want to know if that is failing. If the thing that you put as a bulwark against failure of some kind is in fact itself failing, then you would want to know about that. But more importantly, you would want to set goals for that. You would want to have targets. You would want to ensure that the thing that you're relying to help you is going to be there to help you or the user when that's required. So overall, SLOs as a mechanism for setting organizational targets with respect to the behavior of subsystems and or the user experience. There's nothing about graceful degradation systems that offsets your obligation to do that. You don't get to say, oh yes, we put a cache system in and therefore we can stop thinking about these other things. Like, nothing like that at all. That still remains true. However, there is of course a tension with SLO proliferation, where you end up with a very large number of things to care about, monitor, manage, set, etc. And of course I'm told there are software tools that will help you out with this. But in general, there's for any control mechanism, if it proliferates widely, it becomes less useful just because there's fewer things you can keep in your own kind of cognitive cache about what to care about. However, long story short, I think that in general, we're best served, both the users and the managers of the systems are best served if you are maintaining SLOs for the graceful degradation as well as the core systems, for all of the obvious reasons about internal visibility, but also because in many cases they represent a meaningful degradation of user experience that we would definitely want to know about. I mean, if you woke up in the morning and it turned out you had been serving 100% 720p for the last 2 weeks, like, you would probably know about that. Now, hopefully, you would probably want to know about that. Now, hopefully your customer churn number or whatever, or customer retention thing, which is going down like that as you are squirting out 720p unrelievedly. But I do think that even though it's more complex, it's worthwhile doing that.
I think there's an interesting side case as well that I've seen more rarely, but sometimes, where the standard operation mode is the degraded mode, and they are sopping up extra CPU or whatever at trough to do some extra fun stuff. And then you want to pen your normal SLO at that baseline when you're degraded, right? And then have a separate tracking mechanism for the non-degraded extras, which is a fun upside down way of doing it.
Yeah,
well, very interesting.
Well, I just want to kind of flip it on its head a little bit, because we've talked a lot about using SLOs to measure systems in a degraded state. But what about using SLOs to determine when you should degrade, right? Are your error budgets a good potential trigger value to figure out when an automated process should perhaps change the state of your system?
I have a lot of feelings and thoughts about this, so cut me off if I go too long. Or rather, my instinctive instant reaction is absolutely not, no way, but that's because the types of degradation that I'm used to are extremely real-time, extremely latency sensitive. So on the other hand, yes, if you're wanting to do something that like is enabled, like it's on or off in like an hour's time scale, then absolutely you could do something with your SLOs with the measurement, because an SLO tends to be measured over time. Frequently they're measured in logs rather than in live monitoring to make sure that the accuracy is really high. So you could use those as well. But I'm used to services that, for example, would do a degradation based on the live traffic that even that instance of the binary is seeing, to say my CPU load is so high that I'm going to reject 20% based on the classification of the traffic types. And that will be the graceful degradation that you did in advance. There is the classification of traffic types such that individual tasks can shed appropriately and say you only get 100 results because I shed the ones that were the extras. for example, or I shed the one like Mandy's example. This was the query that was meant to render the credit score, and so it's not as important. It's tier 3. I can drop that traffic, and there you want the system to be hyper responsive. So it really depends on what you're doing. And in the caching mode, right, like you want it to fail the hit on disk and immediately hit the cache. You don't want that to be something that's kind of delayed on the whole system. Like you need to decide on the latency of your degradation. Do you want it to be hyper responsive down to the local task, or do you want it to be system wide and thus slow to kick in, but potentially have a better picture of the whole story?
I'll take the opposite side of that for pure badness or possibly entertainment purposes. I will say that actually I could see a rationale, although it depends very much on your use case. And if you're in the super real time, people notice the milliseconds world, you know, perhaps this is less of a strong argument. But I could see a situation where you are suddenly consuming error budget a lot, and there is a graceful degradation mechanism that you can apply. And for the purposes of this question, let's say you have to apply it manually because it's a business decision, like the degradation is so severe in some sense. You go, okay, we press the big red button and we're still doing something while the other stuff is in trouble. So I can see that. I can also see a weaker argument for an automatic replacement when the degradation is severe. But again, there's a super, like it's super highly indexed on what the specifics of your business situation is.
I completely agree with that, actually, Niall. I think that you're right. Anytime that it's a business decision that, again, a human latency, I say order hours. I guess I mean order like half an hour, really. Like, let's be realistic. You need to get your director on a phone and so on. Like, if it can be made like that, completely agree. I think my rule of thumb is I never want an SLO to be in the live like trigger path directly on like a single task level. Just because building infrastructure on top of that makes it really difficult to shift your SLOs, and you should be shifting your SLOs on a semi-regular basis. Like it gets really tangled up. So an SLO, the metric that feeds the SLO maybe, but not necessarily the SLO.
I was trying to disagree with you, Jennifer, and just anyway. Okay, let's go on. Let's go on.
Well, I don't know. I think it's actually a pretty interesting potential use of SLOs, right? Let's go back to Mandy's um, credit score box example, right? Would it not perhaps be useful to have an SLO that measures how often that box renders correctly? And if the error budget's depleted over time in terms of, how often that's being served, we could go back to the example where we're talking about perhaps serving nothing is actually better than it flickering in and out of existence for the user, right? So would that not perhaps be a potential use of an error budget triggering a decision, an automated decision to just turn that part of the system off until we can fix things? I'm curious what Mandy has to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would. I mean, anything that's automatic, that it's like a business decision, like folks are going to maybe be a little itchy about that. But like yeah, like I feel like you should be able to use that to trigger, especially if you've got really wobbly backends. Like folks that are working in like large distributed environments with lots of little microservices, they're doing their own thing, and you've got one wobbly wheel back in the back end that's serving something maybe not completely trivial, but something that you can sort of do without for most use cases. Being able to sort of compress that thing or hide it automatically, I think would be super helpful in a lot of cases. And there will be other cases where you want VP sign off before you turn that thing off, or those kinds of things. Like that definitely happens. That needs to be a business decision up front before the thing even gets designed, long before it reaches production. Like what actually is the failure scenario for this thing and what we expect it to be, and then you revisit that on a regular basis as it gains traction or doesn't. Maybe you can just turn it off completely and get rid of it if it's really that bad. And using your SLOs as that benchmark might be helpful for some teams. I think I don't know that I've talked to anyone or any team that's been using SLOs in that sophisticated a manner to make a hard line opinion about it.
I think a good SLO is not always necessarily just one thing, like it's trying to do a bunch of stuff at once. So I would instead tend to say, I will tie this to the same SLI, the same metric as my SLO, but I would do it next to it rather than on top of it. You know?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The same measurements you use to inform your SLIs and therefore your SLOs are often useful numbers, right? And even as the SLO guy, I'm ready to admit that those numbers can be used in many different ways and not just to power SLOs and error budgets. So to make sure we have some time for questions at the end, I do want to throw one kind of curveball at the panelists. I would love to hear about a time that you realize you were experiencing a system in a degraded state that you were not expecting it to. This doesn't have to be at work, right? Like I remember, like my example here is I was logging into large streaming service, right? And I noticed that the recommendation box was gone. I don't actually use that very often, but I noticed it was gone. And I happen to know a lot of engineers at large streaming service. So I DM'd one of them on Twitter, RIP. And I just asked, like, is that gone because something's broken? And they're like, oh, yeah. When that service isn't working well enough, we just turn it off, right? Like we don't display it because that's better than displaying you an error. And I was like, oh, that's neat. It's kind of cool. Like I noticed that. So I'm gonna put people on the spot. What are some times that you've noticed a system, and it doesn't even have to be a computer system. It could be anything out there in the world, right? Any socio-technical system. What are examples of a good graceful degradation that you've ran into?
I'm not going to say it's necessarily good, but on occasion, the Irish Rail banner, like LCD banner in the carriage, will, instead of representing successfully the station that you are about to make your way onto, will say this train goes to Pier Station or whatever. And okay, at least you know the line that you are on, which you probably knew if you were looking out of the window or if you had taken the train ever before, but you don't know what the stations are. But maybe if you're just going to Pier Station, that's it.
I like that. I like that.
So I also had a transit one. So back in 2017, I got on a bus south of Naples, and by the time I got off the bus at the airport, my airline had gone bust. So I was stood there in Naples airport with several thousand other very angry British travelers with nowhere to go. And due to the legal system, right, this degraded to a very exhausted Air Emirates flight and all of their crew taking us back to London kind of against their will. Because the degraded mode for an airline going bankrupt was that other airlines were put under emergency order to fulfill the need. And that was certainly unanticipated.
Man, my travel's been so lucky, right? Like I've definitely seen the trains default to where we're going rather than the stop. Like saw that actually in Paris on the tram last week. But yeah, I see this actually if you're visiting the same sites kind of all the time, you probably aren't even noticing it. But if you're paying attention, you can start to notice it. Like comments sections fall off all the time. Like all kinds of places will drop their comments. There's for whatever reason is going on there. You don't know what's going if they're using an outsourced component or if it's internal and it's not there anymore. I can't leave my vitriol on the bottom of this post today because it's no longer available. And I've definitely seen the large streaming services dump recommendations or up next or those kinds of features if things are wonky. So yeah. Knocking wood though about travel. Like I've never been on an airplane that's gone out of business. So.
All right. Well, awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. I think this has been a really good conversation. And please get some more questions in, but we do already have a few. So I'd like to jump over to those to make sure that we have some time for them. So the first one from Dan Shoup. This one's pretty long, so I'm going to paraphrase you a little bit, Dan. I hope you don't mind. Just talking about working at HBO. and being a streaming service, of course, right? We've talked about streaming services a lot, and actually, I like talking about streaming services a lot because they're an example of like things many people use literally every day, regardless of what they do for a living. And they're very complex systems, they have many moving parts, so I actually love talking about them. And they're explicitly customer facing, right? But anyway, so Dan's question is basically at HBO, if they had very large premieres, like things like the Game of Thrones new season, things like that, that they would degrade certain parts of their system, right? And the example he gave was a prime example is playback markers. I'll read this part live. This involves users setting a marker where they are in a playback stream. So you could pick up at the marker if you move to a different device or restarted your connection. Given how these were normally sent every 15 seconds, you can imagine how this can quickly scale to a DOS level attack when you have extremely large events. So he's kind of asking, turning this off would help other parts of the service continue to run better, right? Just I think from a resource perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So the entire service wasn't overburdened. And his actual question with all that background is discuss how we should measure and think about SLOs in such scenarios.
It's a really good question and very technically detailed, which I don't know that we'll be able to do justice to. But I will tell you what I would probably do. And the first thing I would probably do is I would say, okay, the playback marker service, which as I understand it, sends these things every n seconds, is designed to support a user activity. The user activity is switched from screen 1 to screen 2 or whatever. How often as a background rate does that take place normally? Is it 10% of your users do this? Is it 50% of the users do this? Does it have some kind of gearing on what the event is? Like maybe for a live stream event or whatever, people switch devices a lot and maybe otherwise they don't if they're binging. But basically what I would do is I would go, okay, how common is this user activity for which this service that this service supports? If it's a very widespread user activity, then we would probably like to prefer this playback marker service remaining active in such a way that it doesn't degrade other services, but enables the user activity. If this activity of the user switching screens is not widely distributed, then we can get away with much more variability in it. And so that actually might be a candidate for kind of even real-time exchanges. If it creates breathing room of compute capacity for the rest of the service, then you could even start to think about it that way. But for SLOs, I would gear it off the proportion of the user base that expects this to happen kind of seamlessly and so on.
I would suggest something a little bit different, which is to say the blasphemy that SLOs don't do everything, which is to say that if you have exceptional circumstances that you know are not going to be happening very often, such as a large product launch or a streaming the Super Bowl, right? It may be appropriate to say, to write a unique plan for that event with your goals and the metrics you intend to meet those goals using, and to say, and for this event, we are suspending the SLO on this other thing. For this reason, with the understanding that we are losing this value, right? The question of when it becomes worthwhile to do the engineering to integrate that kind of special event with your other services, like Niall's describing, is a question of how often are these showstoppers happening, right? How much work is it? And then price that against the frequency that you would have to otherwise disable the SLO and thus not have the understanding and the data of how it's behaving. Just be a little pragmatic about it. Like, just because we can do it fully and well doesn't mean we should in every circumstance.
Very much agreed. We have a few more questions, so I'm going to try to get through those. Next, from Anthony, I hope I'm pronouncing this correct, Chiazzo. Question is, your degraded video quality example, how are you measuring this? Very curious about mechanics that are at play under the covers. Mandy, do you have any thoughts about measuring these kind of things?
I've got
Shaking
nothing
her
on
head.
video streaming. Like that is not my my foray at all. So yeah.
I can actually answer a little bit of this. You need metrics from the client to help you make these decisions, right? So when you are a video streaming service and you are figuring out what kind of bits to send out via that stream, you need to have feedback from the client that is displaying this video with what kind of data it is currently able to accept, whether or not that is oh, sorry, dog barking in the background. Whether or not that is, literal understanding of the bandwidth available to that client or how many errors are being processed by that client, but you do need some amount of feedback. So measure from the client or at least get feedback from the client that then tells the server how to operate is generally how you would get that kind of decision making in place.
Just be conscious of having slightly lower expectations on client-side metrics that you're going to actually get them back in short order and with full accuracy compared to stuff that's on your servers. So
Yeah.
I might be a little bit more reluctant to peg things off of that unless you need to peg them off of that. If you need to, then you should do it.
Absolutely, but you need some amount of feedback from the other side, right? You can't make that decision entirely from the server side. You need some amount of data, some amount of telemetry coming off the client itself. Next question anonymously. Are you all proposing that an SLO burndown be used to automate the implementation of an intentional service degradation? I think the consensus was no, but we can squint and see a world where maybe maybe you'd want to.
Well, yeah, like there's a couple of ways you can think of it. One way to think of it is SLO burn down almost always triggers some kind of automatic action. It's just that the automatic action is page the SRE team or the developers or whatever. Could you also tie it to some automated activity? Yes, you could. In general, is that advisable? Well, I suppose most folks would say that if your system is behaving unreliably, compelling an additional potentially unreliable system to come in to paper over the results of the first one possibly has some trouble. But it's, in my opinion, it's really a case-by-case thing.
I agree that it's case by case. I would say my wariness comes in part from if you're building good SLOs that are bringing in lots of different perspectives to tell you whether your service is behaving well, that should not be the same type of specific, like server-specific, endpoint-specific metric that you want to be using to trigger actions and automated actions. So if your SLO is so hyper-specific that you can use it directly to trigger an automated degradation process of some kind, you've probably not done great on making it an SLO, right? It's just another graph.
Some kind of generic mitigation, perhaps, Macy?
You can go see it on O'Reilly, but there is a different need, right? And SLOs should be engineered to fulfill the need of communication and understanding of your system, which is much more complex than the machine need of a degradation.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. We are at top of the hour, and I know many people probably have other places to be. I want to thank all of our panelists for the great discussion. Seriously, lots of great thought-provoking stuff here. It's been an absolute pleasure. Anyone who put any questions into the chat that we did not answer, we will collectively answer your questions and email them back to you later, or perhaps we'll record some other short videos afterwards. And I just want to, before I say goodbye, I just want to leave everyone with the very important words from the late, great Dr. Richard Cook. All complex systems run in a degraded state at all points in time. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.